I want you to picture something with me for a second. Imagine you are a curious traveler, right? And you finally made it to Barcelona.
Oh, it is such an incredible city to visit.
It really is. So you step through the massive, intricately carved doors of the Sagrada Familia,
Right.
and it's a Sunday morning, and you are there to attend a Catholic Mass. Naturally, as a visitor, you bring a certain set of expectations with you.
Of course. You expect a traditional vibe.
Exactly. You anticipate this atmosphere of hushed reverence. You're looking up at those soaring tree-like columns. They're all bathed in the shifting light of the stained glass, and you are completely expecting quiet prayer, solemnity, basically a standard, universally recognizable liturgy.
Which makes sense.
Right. But then right in the middle of the service, during the solemn offertory, that sacred silence is just completely shattered.
Utterly destroyed.
Loud, rhythmic, pounding drums start echoing through the nave, and rushing down the center aisle, heading straight for the altar, is a parade of costumed devils carrying fiery torches and spinning sparklers.
Yet it is the absolute definition of a cultural collision.
It really is.
Because, you have this globally recognized space of sanctuary, a place that projects an aura of absolute peace, and suddenly it feels as though a medieval street riot has just broken through the front doors.
A medieval street riot is the perfect way to put it.
The blueprint you brought for how a sacred space should operate is instantly overwritten by smoke, fire, and noise.
Which brings us to the mission for our deep dive today. We are looking into this jarring, fiery spectacle known as the Corfoc, which translates to the fire run.
Right, the Corfoc.
And the accompanying Bal de Diable, or the Dance of Devils. We're going to explore how a shocked visitor's perspective completely collides with the local Catalans' deeply rooted faith.
And it is a deep, deep faith.
Yeah. We want to understand the actual mechanics and theology behind why the Catholic Church allows literal demons and explosives into its most sacred spaces. Because I have to admit, putting myself in the shoes of that bewildered tourist trying to make sense of the chaos, it just feels entirely out of place.
Oh, sure.
It looks like a desecration.
Well, that reaction makes complete sense for an outsider. When we encounter religious spaces, especially ones as iconic as the Sagrada Familia, we carry our own cultural conditioning regarding what is appropriate or holy.
Right, our own baggage.
Exactly. To actually understand this spectacle, we have to put down the lens of modern, quiet reverence and pick up a completely different, much older theological framework. We really have to look at the theology of Christus Victor.
Christus Victor. Let's define that, because the Latin translates roughly to Christ the Conqueror, right?
That's right.
If I remember my theology correctly, this is a model that focuses heavily on cosmic spiritual warfare. It frames the divine narrative as a definitive victory over the forces of death and chaos, rather than just, a quiet personal salvation.
You have the definition right on the money. In the Mediterranean Catholic tradition, this fiery parade isn't celebrating evil in the slightest. It's a highly theatrical, physical dramatization of good triumphing over evil. The devils, you see, they aren't invading the sanctuary to take it over.
So what do they do?
They are performing a deeply symbolic act of submission.
Oh, wow.
By physically entering the church and marching right up to the foot of the altar, they are visibly acknowledging the supreme power of the Eucharist. It's a physical manifestation of chaos being tamed, bound, and brought to heel by the sacred mystery.
Okay, so if I'm visualizing the choreography of this, it's less like villains crashing a wedding to ruin it,
Right.
and much more like defeated rebels being brought in handcuffs before the king to publicly bow down and surrender.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize the movement. And the mechanism that allows this to happen inside the liturgy is a crucial concept called enculturation.
Enculturation.
Yeah, this is the church's long-standing, very deliberate process of integrating local cultural customs into religious worship. The goal is to ensure that the faith actually feels at home in a specific region.
Instead of feeling like a foreign import.
Exactly. The church looks at a local culture, finds the elements that point toward truth, and absorbs them into the ritual.
And for Catalonia, I guess the native language of celebration just happens to involve a massive amount of fire, gunpowder, and drum lines.
It really does.
But if we look at the specific timing, this spectacle happens during the offertory. That's the part of the service where the bread and wine are brought up to the altar. Why choose that specific transitional moment for the fire run?
Well, the timing there is incredibly intentional. The offertory is the moment in the Mass when the work of human hands is presented.
Right.
For the locals of Barcelona, offering the work of their hands doesn't just mean bread and wine. It includes these centuries-old civic guilds, the traditional dance groups, the
Joyce,
musicians.
I see.
Yeah, when the devils bring their noise and their fire to the altar at that exact moment, the theological message being delivered is that absolutely nothing, not even the most frightening, noisy, or chaotic parts of human nature and mythology, is outside the reach of redemption.
Wow, that reframes the entire visual. Think about that for a second. What does your own hometown or culture value? And how would it look if you brought the loudest, most unpolished version of it directly into a quiet sanctuary?
It's a wildly different perspective.
It is, but I want to push back a bit because even with the theology of enculturation, to a modern eye, this still feels like a stunt.
Sure,
You
yeah.
know, it feels like a youth minister trying a little too hard to make church edgy, or a tourism board trying to manufacture a viral moment.
The modern stun theory is incredibly common among visitors, but it fundamentally misreads the timeline.
Okay.
If we want to understand the origins, we have to wind the clock back to the year 1150,
1150.
when we were talking about the heart of the Middle Ages.
Mm.
Back then, the church utilized something called entremesos. These were short, highly visual street plays used as theatrical teaching tools.
Right, because the general public at the time was largely illiterate. You couldn't just hand out theological pamphlets. You
Exactly.
had to make the concepts visceral and visual.
Precisely. The original narrative of the Bal de Diable in these medieval plays was the cosmic struggle between Saint Michael the Archangel and the devil.
Okay.
And the foundational rule, the absolute key to these plays, was the ending. The angels always win and the devils are always forced to kneel. It was basically street-level catechism.
So they have been literally acting out that concept of submission in costume for nearly 1,000 years.
Yeah.
But how did that street theater connect to the actual sacraments of the church? Like, how did it get from the street to the liturgy?
Well, it became deeply intertwined with the Feast of Corpus Christi, which celebrates the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. During these massive citywide street processions, the clergy would carry the monstrance.
The ornate golden vessel, right?
Right. The vessel holding the consecrated host. They'd carry it through the town squares, and the people running out in front of it were the costumed devils.
Wait, running in front of it?
Yeah. They would run ahead of the procession to clear the way, using loud noises, drums, and fire. They were paradoxically acting as chaotic servants.
That is wild.
Their wildness, the smoke, and the sparks actually served a visual purpose. They created a stark contrast that highlighted the orderly, peaceful, and holy sacrament following right behind them.
The cultural divide on the concept of fire itself is fascinating here.
Oh, absolutely.
For someone coming from a North American or Northern European background, the smell of sulfur and the sight of open flame in a religious context almost exclusively screams danger or demonic activity.
Right, it's tied to imagery of hell and damnation.
Exactly. But for a local Catalan, you're saying that exact same sensory input, the smell of sulfur, triggers a feeling of spiritual cleansing and holy celebration.
Yeah, the cultural translation of fire is completely inverted depending on your geography. Mediterranean Catholicism views fire as an intensely purifying element.
Really?
Look at the St. Joan bonfires in Catalonia. They light massive fires on St. John's Eve to celebrate the birth of John the Baptist. Inside the church, the heat of the torches, which they call teas, and the sharp scent of the sparks act as powerful sensory cues that a holy festival is taking place.
So they aren't scared by it.
Not at all. In the Catalan mindset, gunpowder essentially serves the same ritual purpose as incense does in a quiet cathedral.
Gunpowder acting as Catalan incense. That perfectly captures the sensory flip.
It really does.
But there's a missing link in this timeline. We have medieval street plays and Corpus Christi processions outside the church. How does a rowdy street festival actually migrate indoors to become part of the modern liturgy?
To understand that mechanism, we have to look at the political realities of the 20th century, specifically the aftermath of the Franco dictatorship in Spain.
Okay, right.
Under Francisco Franco's regime, many regional expressions of Catalan identity, including the language, and these very street festivals, were heavily suppressed in public life. The fascist state wanted a unified, homogenized Spanish culture.
But the Catholic Church, due to its concordats and independent agreements with the Vatican, often maintained a level of autonomy that the secular public squares did not, right?
That is the exact mechanism. Because of that autonomy, the local parishes became safe havens. The church in Catalonia has historically been a staunch defender of the local culture.
Oh, interesting.
So when the dictatorship ended, and the 1970s and 80s brought a massive cultural revival, The street guilds and the clergy formed an alliance. The church decided to formally rebaptize these street Korfaks.
Wow.
They explicitly invited these devil groups, known as the Kalas, back indoors for major liturgical feasts. It was a way of saying, your culture was preserved here, and now it is welcome to worship here.
Let's overlay this history onto the physical space we started with, because it is one thing to invite a drumline into a standard medieval stone cathedral. It is an entirely different experience when this happens inside Antoni Gaudi's masterpiece, the Sagrada Familia.
Oh, Gaudi is the linchpin to understanding the physical setting.
Yeah.
He didn't just design a building. He designed a temple of the people and a Bible in stone. The architecture of the Sagrada Familia physically mirrors the exact theological drama we see in the Bal de Diables.
Okay, yeah. If you look closely at the exterior facades of the Sagrada Familia, it's not just saints and angels. There are carvings of reptiles, amphibians, and bizarre monsters.
Exactly.
But crucially, they are all positioned to be crawling downward, fleeing away from the sacred symbols and the cross.
The building itself is telling the story of evil fleeing from the holy. So when the Korfak happens inside the nave, that live performance is a living, breathing, kinetic version of the architectural struggle that Gaudi carved into the very walls.
That is incredible.
And you have to remember, Gaudi was considered a radical. He despised the idea of a church functioning as a cold, quiet, untouchable museum.
He wanted a cathedral of the poor, right?
Yes, explicitly. He believed the church should represent the soul of a people, which meant he wanted the sights, the sounds, the colors, and even the gritty reality of the street to be part of the spiritual experience.
There is a massive, almost tragic irony there for modern visitors.
Oh, entirely.
You have millions of tourists paying for tickets, expecting a pristine, silent World Heritage monument. They are completely unaware that the architect literally designed the structure to be a loud, chaotic, living organism that interacts with the city around it.
It highlights a profound disconnect between the creator's original intent and the modern consumer's expectation of what a monument should be. Gaudi wanted the architecture to shout.
And the fire runs do the shouting.
Exactly. The locals who organize these fire runs see themselves as the living stones of that exact vision. They are fulfilling the architect's dream of a church that breathes with the people.
I want to play the skeptic here, though. Even if the history lines up, and even if Gaudi himself would have stood in the front row cheering the drumline on, we have to ask the ultimate liturgical question.
Okay, let's hear it.
Does a parade of fireworks and drums actually belong in a modern Catholic Mass today? Because you are dealing with a sacrament that requires focus, and this seems fundamentally distracting.
You are tapping into a significant, ongoing, and highly passionate debate within the church itself. There are two very distinct, well-argued sides to this, and it centers on the tension between the sacred and the profane.
Let's unpack the critics' argument first. I imagine they're looking at the sheer sensory overload and arguing that it crosses a boundary.
The critics focus heavily on the theological boundary that separates the sacred, which is meant to be set apart exclusively for God, from the profane, which is the secular, everyday world outside.
Right.
From their perspective, the Mass is intended to be a sacrifice of praise, characterized by a certain level of solemnity and focus. They argue that a sensory-heavy spectacle like a fire run totally hijacks the attention of the congregation.
It's hard to look at the altar when there are fireworks.
Exactly. They feel it distracts from the Eucharist, effectively turning a divine mystery into a human stage performance. And regardless of the historical intent of submission, the sheer visual impact of horned figures and sulfur in the sanctuary feels like a violation of the space's sanctity to many believers.
And if I'm a critic, I'm probably also pointing to events like the Festes de Sant Ramon.
Oh, absolutely.
For those unfamiliar, this is a massive winter festival in Barcelona honoring Saint Raymond of Penyafort, and it draws huge crowds of both locals and tourists.
Massive crowds.
When you merge a giant civic festival like that with a Sunday liturgy, the critics would argue you risk tipping the balance entirely into liturgical tourism. It becomes a show to be consumed, rather than a prayer to be entered into.
The risk of liturgical tourism is a central point of contention. When the flashbulbs of cameras outnumber the people actually praying, the critics argue the rite has been compromised.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But the defenders of the practice don't just rely on sentiment or local pride. They have structural canonical backing.
That's the mechanism I'm curious about. The local parishes aren't operating as rogue entities. There has to be a canonical framework allowing a local bishop to look at this fire run and officially state, yes, this is valid worship. How does that approval actually work?
The defense relies heavily on the general instruction of the Roman Missal, commonly referred to as the GIRM.
The GRM. Okay.
While the GRM mandates strict universal norms for how the Mass is celebrated globally, it also contains specific provisions for legitimate variations and adaptations,
Like a loophole.
more like a built-in flexibility.
Yeah.
If you look at Articles 395 through 399, they outline a mechanism for this. These articles allow local bishops to evaluate a culture's heritage. If the bishop determines that incorporating a specific local element genuinely aids the local congregation in their spiritual life, without fundamentally altering the core Roman rite, it can be approved.
So the local clergy in Barcelona used those articles to argue that bringing the guilds inside isn't an invasion of the secular world. It is a vital baptism of their specific cultural identity.
Exactly the case. And this really illuminates the intense tension between the concept of the global basilica and the local parish.
Oh, I like that framing.
Because to a tourist flying in from across the world, the Sagrada Familia is a global monument that belongs to universal history. But to a family who has lived 3 streets over for generations, it is simply their local parish church.
And that collision of expectations is where the shock happens. What is a deeply familiar, nostalgic, and meaningful cultural offering to a local is a terrifying, bewildering spectacle to a visitor.
Yes.
But taking a step back, the Catholic Church has a long history of dealing with these exact kinds of cultural shocks, doesn't it?
Oh, the history of the church is essentially a history of absorbing and arguing over these cultural shocks. In the Middle Ages, you had the Feasts of Fools, which involved wild role reversals and parody inside the cathedrals.
Oh, right.
In many Latin American traditions today, you can still see heavy statues of local saints being physically danced into the church to the beat of rhythmic indigenous music. But perhaps the most relatable example is the pipe organ.
The pipe organ, really? Because today, the pipe organ is the absolute gold standard of traditional, solemn, high church reverence.
Today it is.
Yeah.
But when it was first introduced to the liturgy centuries ago, it was deemed entirely too worldly and scandalous.
No way. Why?
Because the organ was originally associated with secular Roman arenas and theaters. The critics of the time argued that bringing the instrument of the secular theater into the Mass was a desecration. Over time, the culture absorbed it, and it became the sound of the sacred.
That is a phenomenal parallel. It really forces you to ask, at the end of the day, isn't the core issue simply about the direction of the human heart?
I think so, yes.
Does this fiery display, does the drumming lead a local person's focus toward the altar, or does it stand like a brick wall in the way of the mystery?
That is the ultimate defining metric for any liturgical adaptation. If the noise and the fire break a person's ability to engage with the sacred, then for that individual, the adaptation has failed its purpose. But if bringing the grit and the joy of the street into the nave elevates the local congregation's hearts, then it fulfills Gaudi's deeply held vision of a living, breathing temple. It's the classic, unending tension between universal, quiet truth and loud local expression.
This entire exploration completely flips the narrative. You step into this deep dive assuming you are just analyzing a scandalous modern desecration of a church by a bunch of folks playing with fire and devil costumes.
Yep.
But then you start peeling back the layers. You uncover the medieval theology of Christus Victor. You see the mechanics of how gunpowder translates as incense.
You understand the historical sanctuary the church provided during the Franco era?
Yes. And you see Gaudi's radical architectural vision, and suddenly you realize it's actually this profound theological statement. Absolutely nothing in Catalan culture is too dark, too loud, or too chaotic for the divine to claim and redeem.
It perfectly illustrates how the line between the sacred sanctuary and the secular street has always been beautifully, intentionally blurry in Barcelona.
And once you, as a traveler, or even just as a student of culture, understand that blurry line, you really do start seeing it everywhere in the city.
You really do.
You'll be walking down the street and you'll notice those devil motifs decorating everyday bakeries or forged into the ironwork of ordinary street signs. The sacred and the secular are constantly dancing with each other all over town.
And if we can leave you with one final thought to explore on your own, something that shifts the perspective entirely.
Please do.
When that loud, fiery mass is finally over, when the drums stop echoing and the sulfur smoke clears from the nave, consider stepping outside of the basilica's main doors. Take a moment to look for the cloister, or find the small, incredibly quiet, modest school buildings that Gaudi built right there on the grounds.
He built schools there.
He did. He built them specifically for the children of the Sagrada Familia's bricklayers and construction workers. Or, take a walk across the city and sit inside other historic local spaces like the Cathedral of the Holy Cross or Santa Maria del Mar.
So contrasting the explosive, dramatic heights of the Sagrada Familia's nave with those grounded, humble, and deeply quiet community spaces offers a totally different perspective.
It does. It provides an equally vital look at Gaudi's true vision for the everyday people of Barcelona. The silence and the noise are not enemies. They are simply two sides of the same Catalan soul.